Beautiful. Awesome. So yeah, lovely to see you all. Welcome to lecture 2. The plan for today is basically to talk about 2 kinds of methods. And they're both intimately connected. And really, to call them methods is slightly weird. They're better to think of as sort of families of views. But they're both really driven by the same thought. And what I want to try to do today, I forgot, before I even do that, is something to flag up about the overall structure of the course. Again, as you know, we got to this sort of late, and we're struggling a little bit to make sure all the parts fit together. But one of the things we've got is my friend Alex Fisher, who's here for a year working on a Leverhulme Fellowship on some stuff about VR with me, is going to do a guest lecture for us. So we were going to talk about thought experiments in lecture 5. Alex has written extensively on thought experiments, so he's very happily said that he'll come and do the guest lecture in lecture 6. So that means we've swapped topics for weeks 5 and 6. I'll remind you when we get closer to it. I just wanted to kind of let you know. He's actually working on a little monograph about this stuff, so it'll be interesting, I think, for him to talk to you about the nature of these things and what they're good for and what they're bad for. So that's just to let you know. Again, I'll remind you, I'll make an announcement about it as we go. But what do I want to do today? I want to start by kind of slagging off philosophy for not making much progress in ever. And to say some things about why the worries about lack of philosophical progress might actually motivate us to adopt one of the 2 methods that we're going to talk about today. So that'll be the kind of opening gambit, is getting us the very broad motivation that'll take you either to logical positivism or to OLP, ordinary language philosophy. After that opening gambit, we'll turn to positivism. Now, have you guys come across this term before? Yeah, okay, so some nodding, right? So it's also called logical empiricism. They're really broad. Basically, the names here are a bit blurry. We'll call it logical positivism. That's probably the broader of the 2 names, but it doesn't really matter. Here I want to tell you about what the view actually is, or what the method kind of is, the basic motivation for it, what's so good about it, and then raise a few objections to it. So that'll be section 2. And then in section 3, we'll turn to a sister option, which is this ordinary language philosophy. And frankly, OLP is a direct response in many ways to logical positivism. A lot of the people who are really interested in positivism moved into OLP. And it's interesting because there's a sense in which they are radically different, but there's another sense in which they really do have the same kind of basic idea at their core. So when we get to that, I'll tell you a little bit about what the view is meant to be, what the method is, give you an example or 2, hopefully, and then talk a little bit about what's good about it and some flaws it faces. And then we'll set ourselves up to go talk about the next lecture. So that's the plan for today. Again, we'll aim to I'd like to try and hit the break after the positivism stuff, but we'll sort of see how the time goes and how we're doing. Cool? Beautiful. And I should say, even if you haven't gotten the chance to do the reading, it's worth going back and maybe looking over, especially the Baz stuff, after we're done. So it was the little chapter that's on OLP. I'm going to do the best I can to deliver a very fair evaluation of both of these views, and I hope that comes across, even if my own personal tastes may or may not align with some of them. Okay. So let's start off by talking about progressive worries, as I put it. And I guess the way we can kind of get involved here or get going is by thinking about what the epistemic status of many philosophical claims is or are. I'm going to pick on metaphysics, which is funny because that's in many ways the subdiscipline that I work mostly in. But yeah, so let's take metaphysics, right? And take a claim from any metaphysician, right, that's in particular non-empirical. Well, can we know whether a metaphysical claim is true or false? Or, taking a metaphysical debate, is there a way to conclusively settle the debate? So here's a test case for those of you who remember this example from the logic class last year, right? One of the lectures in the second half, we talked about properties. There was a question, do properties exist? Okay, let's suppose we say yes. Well, if we say yes, what kind of thing are they? Are they universals? If they're universals, are they Platonic universals? Are they Aristotelian universals? Are they located in Platonic heaven, or are they temporally and spatially located where their instances are? Now, when I presented those views to you last year, right, I tried to kind of tell you what the view was and then raise a few objections to them. And we went through that pretty quick. But in every case, as you remember, there were things to say back to the objections. It's not like, oh, this objection, bang, this view is dead. Right? It was just like, oh, here's a problem. Here's a way maybe we could fix the problem. You might ask, is there anything that'll actually settle this once and for all? One reason to be maybe pessimistic here is that these claims are, by their very nature, super empirical. That is, they're all designed to be equally okay with regards to whatever empirical observations we make. Similarly, they're not, by their nature, analytic. It's not like just the simple meaning of the term property tells you right away that it's a Platonic universal. So there's no kind of empirical reasons to go one way or the other. There's no sort of, at least obviously, analytic reasons to go one way or the other, right? How do we settle this debate? And it's worth noting that, as the little joking picture here suggests, this debate about properties as Platonic versus Aristotelian universals has been going on as long as Western philosophy has existed. Something pretty much like it. And between friends, we ain't made no real progress. Those wheels are still spinning in that same mud. And I picked this debate just as an example because it's one that I'm familiar with, but I'm sure you can think of other ones that you've come across in your time thinking about philosophy. And I'm picking again on metaphysics because it's a particularly clear one where the claims are, by their design, not going to be settled by empirical matters or by analytical matters. But the same could be said for other areas of philosophy too. So, how do we know whether a metaphysical claim is true or false? How could we come to know its truth or know its falsity? How could we settle a metaphysical debate? No real obvious answer. These are still kind of going, the same debates that these guys were having. Given the lack of progress here, given the lack of epistemic certainty, you might start to be pretty pessimistic. And if you really ride that pessimism train, you might start to think that metaphysical claims are in some sense defective, epistemically defective. They're the kind of thing, not just that we haven't settled, that we don't know, but you can't know. Maybe because the roots that we have to knowledge, right? Empirical search, a priori analytic analysis, don't really get us to answers. Maybe there is no way. They're epistemically defective somehow. They're unknowable. Okay, let's just run with that thought for a second. I'm not really a pessimist by nature, but maybe there's something to this. Maybe that would at least explain why there's no progress. Well, why are they epistemically defective? What's going wrong? But we can take a little bit of what I just said a second ago as kind of maybe possible answers. I mean, one reason is because they're just a priori, and they're not connected to a posteriori epistemic searches. It's not like we can go out and kind of crack open the desk and find the Platonic or Aristotelian universal inside. But that's not a good answer, because there's plenty of other things that we think are epistemically acceptable that are a priori. Mathematics looks like one. Other stuff that we might think of as apt for a priori analysis. So merely not being a posteriori or not relying on epistemic work isn't enough. And the same thing the other way around, right? There's plenty of stuff that we think that, right, is a posteriori that's cool. Just think of any of the natural sciences. It's pretty clear that whatever we think of the Marga Campa building, the guys who built it knew how to do their jobs. Whether they did a good thing or not is another question. So again, I hope you can kind of see the idea that I'm trying to get you down here, right? Is given the lack of progress, you might start to think, okay, maybe there's something really wrong with these debates, with the claims being made. They're epistemically defective. We can't know them. And then we're led to the question of why is it we can't know them? And it's not because they don't rely on just one of these. It's going to be something else. Now here, let me take a little segue. And I want to do a demarcation. And it's probably one you're already familiar with, but it doesn't hurt to hear it again. And it's a demarcation between being grammatical and being sensible. So, let's just deal with English, because I'm still working on that language. God knows if we tried to do this in Dutch, we would be very quick into the ungrammaticalities. But just take this sentence, Tilburg is in Austria. In English, this is grammatically correct. It follows the rules of English grammar, whatever they are. It says something sensible. It says something meaningful. And it says something that's truth apt. That is, it takes a truth value. In this case, it takes the truth value of being false. It's false. Tilburg's not in Austria. Contrast this with Tilburg, Austria, in is. This is grammatically incorrect, and it doesn't say anything. It's meaningless. It doesn't say anything sensible. Yeah.
But in this case, we don't worry about if Austria would attack the Netherlands and Tilburg is.
Good. But note here, even whether we care about it being true or false, the important thing is it's truth apt. It takes a truth value. There's a further question about which one it gets, but the point I'm really interested in is that it says something that could be true and it could be false. That's the important thing. Right? The actual truth value, I don't really care. Right? I just care that this is a sentence that could take any truth value. Similarly, here's another one, right? Tilburg isn't Tilburg. Now, this sentence is grammatical, it's sensible, or at least prima facie sensible. It says something that's meaningful, and it's truth apt. It takes a truth value. But arguably, in this case, it's necessarily false. If it has a truth value at all, it must be false, because if Tilburg is anything, it is itself. And there's ways we can start to paraphrase it and hear it metaphorically where it turns out to be true. But again, if we're being strict. The contrast I really want to draw is this one. Again, grammaticality, right? This is a grammatically correct, sensible sentence. It says something. This is just garbage. It's just some English words in some order. It doesn't say anything at all. So far, so good? Now, take this. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Have people heard this before? Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Grammatically, perfectly good. Perfectly grammatical. Does it say anything? Is it sensible? Well, according to Chomsky and many people, no. It doesn't say anything that you can actually make sense of. You can start to make sense of it or feel like you're starting to make sense of it, but at best what you're doing is getting parts. What would it be to be a colorless green triangle? What does it mean to sleep furiously? Well, maybe that one I can kind of get a grip on. I'm pretty sure I've seen my dog sleep furiously with it. But the thought here is it looks like this is a sentence that's grammatically correct, but not sensible. It doesn't say anything.
So why is it not sensible?
So the thought is that if you try and actually articulate a kind of condition that it would be, you're only understanding parts of the sentence.
So it seems like you're just attaching three different properties to the ideas, namely that they're green, colorless, and sleeping.
Yeah.
So that seems like something just sensible, and the fact that ideas can sleep and things that are colorless can't also be green would just be logically. You could just logically say about them that's
Nice. Yeah, so I mean, one of the things we can do is take this sentence and say it's more like Tilburg isn't Tilburg. It's sensible, and it just says something that's necessarily false. So the thought here is that, and I, to be honest, kind of agree with you. But the thought is that what Chomsky wants to lean on, and what people who see this as not being sensible lean in, is that this is something like a category mistake. It's like saying Nathan is the property of being happy. Or better, Nathan is happiness. Now that one should start to feel weird. And it starts to feel weird because is happiness is of a different kind, a different type than an object is. Nathan is, like a first order object. Or another one, Nathan is railroad. Right, to go from that. That one again, kind of grammatical. It's on the edge. But it's really hard to figure out what's being said. But I take the point. So the thing really what I'm after here is it seems like there's at least a space, a conceptual space, for sentences that are grammatical, but don't say anything. Right? The thought is there's a conceptual gap between grammaticality and sensibility. Or to put it another way, grammatical satisfaction being grammatically acceptable and actually expressing something that's true fact. That's the kind of thought here. Now, we can disagree about the case, and I kind of do too. But all I really need is that kind of conceptual gap. So do we see or do we feel the kind of conceptual gap?
Yeah. More to get more of a grip on sensible. If a phrase is grammatically correct, like this is a poetry, it does not say anything. It does not say anything sensible per se, but it is supposed to invoke a certain emotion. How would that filter within the context of sensibility?
Nice. So this kind of, one of the things that we also need to do here is we've got to be very careful in the sorts of sentences we're paying attention to. So again, I'm going to lean on something we talked about last year in logic, way back in lecture 1. If you remember, I made a distinction between asatoric and non-asatoric sentences. So basically the thought is there's some kind of sentences that assert, and there's a whole slew of other ones that don't. Questions, commands, exclamations. Can you buy the next round? Commanding, buy the next round. Or saying, Jesus. Those don't assert. By their very nature, they're not the kind of sentences that can take truth values. Because grammatically, they just don't say anything about the world. So we might think in the poetic cases, it's more like a non-asatoric sentence. We're only thinking here about asatoric sentences. So that's something important to keep in mind. And what we're trying to argue, or at least trying to drive a little wedge here, is that it seems possible for there to be asatoric-looking strings. This looks like an asatoric sentence, but goes the thought, it's not. It's a grammatical facsimile. It's a fraud. It looks like a duck, but it's actually a cleverly disguised mule. Something. The important thing here, when we're thinking about sensibility, to put it really bluntly, is that it even says something at all. Might be something totally false, right? Unnecessary falsehood. And I take it this is how you were reading it, right? Or it might just say nothing. Santa is a blab. Kind of grammatical, depends on how we read blab. But does it say anything? No. Probably closer to a non-esoteric sentence than anything. This is the big, deep concept. And we're going to build from this. But the thought is that there might be some sentences, or something, it's not even really fair to call them sentences, some expressions that look like esoteric sentences but aren't. They're grammatically correct. They say nothing. They don't take truth values. They're not even in the truth game. Not even false. And here's the thought. Right? Remember where we were coming from. Why is it that so many philosophical debates haven't made any progress? Why is it that, to pick on metaphysics, metaphysical claims seem to be epistemically defective? Answer. They're nonsense. They're grammatically correct, but they say nothing. They are linguistically defective. Grammatically fine, semantically empty. They don't say anything. They're not even apt to be true or false. You might as well have been whistling. And the fact that they're linguistically defective explains why they're epistemically defective. No wonder you can't know whether properties are universals or Platonic universals, because that's basically the same as saying, blah, 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 blah. Is what I just blathered at you true? No. I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything that could be true or false. I didn't say anything. Goes to thought.
But then you can have the argument against that you don't understand language well enough to.
So that's going to be something we're going to come back to. Now, the important thing is that even to formulate the skeptical position, you've already got to have a grip on meaning. So everybody's spotting, hey, there's a bunch of language that we do know the meaning of. The thought is, why is it that stuff like this turns out to be epistemically defective? This kind of language is bad. Not all language. Metaphysicians, very much what I do, right, turn out to be more like poets than scientists, in that we're bartering and bantering around with different plays on words, but we're not actually asserting. Goes the thought. And I want to stress, I'm picking on metaphysics here, but this kind of thing could be easily extended to lots of areas of philosophy. And in fact, Ayer, if you did the reading, Ayer does this with ethics as well. Aesthetics, ethics, metaphysics, all of these things come under the knife. But exactly which ones we pick, for the moment at least, we can set aside. What matters is just this idea. So the thought is, right, we can explain why there's a lack of progress by their epistemic defectiveness, and they're epistemically defective because they are linguistically defective. They are nonsense. The claims and questions here are bad.
How does this relate to culture and morals and symbolic meanings within a culture? Because some sayings, like in the Netherlands, we say east, west, home, best, doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
We also say helaas pindakaas, unfortunately peanut butter.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't make no sense.
Yeah.
But if I say it within to another Dutch person, they know exactly what I mean.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I think this kind of ties in with something like the poetical expressions, right?
Yeah.
Now note, I'm picking on particular kinds of sentences, but it doesn't necessarily have to be just sentences that are sensible, that have meaning, right? Arguably signs, road signs, have meanings. Right? You see the big red X, right? It's very clearly telling you don't go down this road, right? And it's asserting something in a way.
It's factual too, right? You see an arrow and it's.
That's why, again, it's asserting something, it's telling you something, right? And it's sensible. That's fine. But the relevant case here is going to be something that sounds a lot like one of those phrases, but nobody knows what the hell it means.
Yeah.
My father is full of these kinds of things. Lots of phrases that feel like, oh yeah, I've heard that before. I'm like, hang on, what the hell does that mean? That's the kind of thought here. So again, this is going to be the thought that both of the views we're going to talk about today adopt. So the big dart thought is lots of philosophical claims are nonsense. They don't say anything. They are merely grammatically correct. They look like they're saying stuff, but they don't. And you might wonder what we do when we come across that sort of thing. Now, one option is, okay, let's see if we can find something that is meaningful that's close. Another option, which our boy Hume is expressing here, is if you come across it, you throw it in the fire. And in fact, the views we're going to look at both kind of adopt this option with regards to much of metaphysics. Metaphysics turns out to be sophistry that should be consigned to the flames. Yeah.
Is this assertion also not applicable to itself? This assertion.
Yeah. We're going to come to that too. So this would be a claim. This would be a claim about empirical fact, I guess. Right. That'd be probably the best thing, right? But yes, we're going to come to exactly that kind of thing. So this is the background. This is the background that both options are going to play off. So let's turn to logical positivism. This is the first of the two. So logical positivism is really a family of views that broadly emerged from the University of Vienna. It was also associated with a big reading group at the University of Berlin. There was another group in Warsaw. Huge group. Largely emerged during the interwar years. The core group, you might have heard of them, that really drove this was the so-called Vienna Circle. It was a group of scientists, mathematicians, philosophers, range of people. Their key aim, what they really wanted to do, was to separate sense from nonsense in philosophy. They thought that so much of philosophy was just babble, and that we would be better off if we could excise that and get on the real philosophizing. It's worth noting that this was an extremely political project. Many of the people who were involved in the Vienna Circle were extreme leftists. They really thought that so much of the rhetoric within philosophy, especially in the German-speaking world at the time, was being used basically as empty rhetoric to draw people into what they thought were politically poisonous ideas. They thought, to get rid of this, if we make people into good little philosophical scientists, we'll be better people. Their patron saint, if you want to call it that, is Ludwig Wittgenstein. He did his PhD back in Cambridge, from Austria. And their kind of holy Bible, as it were, is his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. It was his PhD thesis that he sort of wrote under Russell. He actually wrote most of it in a prisoner of war camp during World War I. Long story short, the aim of the Tractatus was to try and show exactly what we could really express if we take a rigorous form of formalism seriously. We're not going to talk about the Tractatus. You might hear more about it in the history of analytic philosophy. But the key thing here is this view sort of really rose to prominence in the interwar years, and to be honest, really died almost just as quickly as it rose to prominence just after the Second World War. According to logical positivism, only two types of statements, of sentences, assertoric sentences, are truth-at. Formal claims and factual claims. Formal claims are analytic, they're necessarily true, and you know them a priori. So there are things like all triangles have 3 sides, or 2 + 2 is 4. You can know they're true simply in virtue of the meaning of the constituent words. If they're true, they're necessarily true. They must be so. And you don't have to go out in the world to learn anything to know that they're true. You can get them merely from your armchair. On the flip side, factual claims are broadly synthetic, they're contingent, and they're a posteriori. You need to go and do some empirical work to learn them. So, this thing is a dog, rather than a cleverly disguised mule. This weighs 1.5 kilos. That would be a hell of a lot of coffee. Right? There are things where you have to do some empirical work to find out. Everything else, nonsense. Not truth-at. Running with this, right? And you should know, right? This kind of claim right here, that these are the only kind of truth-at-y sort of things. To go back a few slides, that's exactly what your boy Hume was saying. That's basically what Hume is pushing at here. Does it concern any abstract reasoning about quantity or number? Is it about analytic matters, basically maths? Is it experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact? That's basically, is it a formal claim or is it a factual claim, as we're characterizing here? If it ain't either of those, chuck it, says Hume. Now, if you buy this, let's say the only viable philosophical method is going to be empiricist. That is, substantive knowledge, knowledge about how the world is only going to be gained from empirical evidence. It's positivist in the sense that said evidence rests on what's immediately given or experienced or perceived. So we don't rely on things like testimony or memory. And it's logical in the sense that we'll use logical deduction and logical analysis to help us evaluate the empirical evidence we get. And we can play around with the strength of these in various ways. But this is really the core of what the logical empiricists believe. So what does the LPist say about metaphysical claims? Well, they're not formal, and they're not factual, so they're not even claims to begin with. They might as well have just been whistles. So goes the LPist. But of course, right, you want to know, the whole view is saying, hey, a bunch of philosophical claims are defective. They're nonsense. So how do we separate the sense from the nonsense? Well, the initial idea is that sensible claims are going to be either analytic or they're going to be verifiable. Verification here being the process of establishing empirical evidence is true by using established empirical evidence as formal truths. Basically going out and looking, to put it really simply. Yeah.
You can also do that with analytical a priori. You can also do that with synthetic a priori knowledge, right?
So in some sense, they have a problem with how exactly to make sense of synthetic a priori. But that's fine, because in some ways, they don't believe any of that. it's going to slot into either one of these two for them.
Yeah.
It's going to either turn out to be, hey, it's true analytically, or there's empirical reasons, or you are just talking out your ass, my dude. That's it. So verification is, again, this process of basically going to look and see, or taking some stuff, some evidence you've already got, and kind of let's see what follows from it, using our logical processes to figure out, does this claim follow from the evidence I've already got? It's actually a really simple view when you boil it down, right? It's, hey, is it verifiable? If it's not verifiable, then it doesn't even say anything. It's just nonsense. So that's the kind of initial version of the view. Now, the thing to note is this is way too strict. Because it's going to turn out that there are lots of claims that are, at least in this sense, not verifiable. Here's an easy one. All humans are mortal. Is that analytic? Is it part of the meaning of the word human that you're mortal? It really seems like it's part of the meaning of being human. Not like baked into the meaning of the word. And does empirical evidence confirm that all humans are mortal? I mean, everybody we've seen so far has died. And, you know.
That we know of.
Yeah, that we know of. Right? But actually, that we know of is really important. Because maybe there's somebody coming later who ain't gonna. If we just go with what we can actually verify, what we've seen, is all humans are mortal verifiable? Not strictly. We need to be around to see every human die. Which, let's not talk about that while the recording's going on. So the problem here is that it seems like there's actually lots of scientifically good claims. Here's another one. I think this is actually on the next slide. Every liquid has a boiling point. Every liquid has a boiling point. This looks like a scientific claim. It looks like an empirical claim. Problem. Doesn't look like one that we could verify, because there's going to be lots of liquids that, given their boiling temperatures, we're never going to be able to test. If we did, we'll all be dead. Hey, at least now we know whether all humans are mortal. So the problem I'm trying to gesture at here is that a flat-footed verificationist account is too strong. It rules out lots of meaningful claims. Now remember, it's not that not being able to verify means it's false, it's that it doesn't even say anything. Right? And there seems lots of meaningful statements, lots of even scientific statements, which may or may not be true, but they're certainly meaningful, that the flat-footed verificationist strategy would say is meaningless. All liquids have a boiling point. That looks like a meaningful claim. We might even want to test it. But it can't be meaningful on that flat-footed version of the view. Yeah?
Sorry, what do you mean with flat-footed?
So the flat-footed one is this one right here, is that sensible claims are either analytic or simply verifiable. That is, we could conduct this process and see what the evidence for it is. And the thought is that lots of these claims are sensible, meaningful, even though we couldn't actually engage in the kind of verification practice. So what do? If we're going to be good little logical positivists, we do a lovely distinction here. We distinguish between verifiable in principle and verifiable in practice. In principle just means, is there some sense in which we could get a grip on what it would look like to verify this? We know what it would look like to verify whether all liquids have a boiling point. We know the kinds of tests that would be involved. We can't do them, but we know what kinds of tests would be involved. That's sufficient for verifiable in principle. The same thing with all humans are mortal. We couldn't make those observations. It's not in practice verifiable, but we know what it would look like to verify this kind of thing.
Isn't that in contradiction with them saying an analytical philosophy is just nonsense?
There's an interesting question here, right? Because this notion of in principle does seem to require having a kind of notion of possibility, which seems to go beyond what they're allowing. There's a worry there. There's a worry there. But note that if we can even just articulate what a verification would look like, that's enough. Because that seems to be at least putting it in terms of sensible experiences that one could have. And that's wheeling it back into the kind of things that they're going to accept. So, to give you a grip, right, we can say, like, is there some possible, in some sense of possible, sense experience that would determine whether a claim is true or false? If yes, then it's verifiable in principle and it's meaningful. If we know what kind of thing you would need to do, in some sense of would need to do, to verify it, cool, you've got a grip on it, it's meaningful, it's verifiable in principle. If you don't, well then we ask, is the claim analytic? And if it is, cool, it's meaningful, right? And that's why you couldn't figure out a verification process. There isn't one. You just got to think about the thing. The meaning does the job. But if you can't think of the verification conditions in principle, and it's not analytic, then it's meaningless. And into the fire it goes. It says nothing, so nothing of value was lost. This is logical positivism. Very characterized, but enough for government work. This gives us the verification principle. So this is taken straight from the reading, A.J. Ayer. It's like a sentence is factually significant to any given person if and only if he knows how to verify the proposition which it purports to express. That is, if he knows what observations would lead him under certain conditions to accept the proposition as being true or reject it as being false. Put another way, go back a slide, it's basically this. Is there some sense experience that in principle would serve as verification? If yes, cool, it's meaningful. If no, and the sentence is an analytic, didn't even say anything. Again, to stress, it's not that it's false, because even to be false, it's got to be meaningful. It doesn't even get in the truth game. So, according to the logical positivists, philosophy as a subject, as the thing that we're doing, is aimed at providing and identifying the verification criteria and or elucidating the logical aspects of scientific language. That is, we're trying to spell out the verification conditions for various claims or show what follows from the already verified claims we have. Our task as philosophers is to clarify the propositions of science, define the symbols which occur in them. We shouldn't be out there building metaphysical systems. We should be serving as handmaidens to science. One of the real nice upshots of this view is that philosophical debates and questions can be solved, in some sense of solved. Because we can look at some philosophical claim that answers a philosophical question and be like, hey, cool, the answer can be verified in this manner. And we state the kind of in principle verification conditions. Or we can say, oh, this claim turns out to be analytic. Or we can say, hey, this claim follows from something that can be verified or is analytic. Or, and here's the real big money, we say, it can't do any of these, So you were just talking shit. There is no debate here because you thought you were debating, but you guys were just blah, 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 blah. You weren't saying anything to each other at all. Now again, I just want to be kind of clear on the viewers. It's not even that there was somebody wrong in this debate, it was that the debate was a misfire to begin with. It would have been better whistling at each other. So why is this view attractive, or prima facie attractive? Some people really, really, really like it. There's a bunch of reasons, but here's a few. So first, it makes philosophy extremely rigorous. All the claims that we're going to make sense, and we have a very clear way of how to connect it up with natural science, social science, with various scientific truths. That's attractive to some people. Relatedly, it gives us extreme epistemic clarity. We have ways to know when philosophical claims are going to be true or false, at least in principle. It's lovely and cohesive in that it connects philosophy intimately with science. Seems kind of nice. And the last two is it gives us a beautiful simplicity of method. Because the method for doing philosophy and the methods for doing science become the same. Finding verification conditions and seeing whether those verification conditions are satisfied or not. That's nice. And it gives us a role within the scientific enterprise. This is the kind of connection between cohesiveness and simplicity. These are meant to be features if you're a logical positivist. Okay, so that's the view. And this is the kind of, why is the view sexy? Before we talk about objections, before we talk about anything, yeah.
Can you elaborate what precisely is the difference between science and philosophy? Then?
Yeah, good. So on this view, there isn't one. On this view, there isn't one. If philosophy has any kind of distinct subject, it is just this bit. Is that what we're really doing is we do some conceptual clarifications and spelling things out. But basically, you might as well give us all lab coats. We are little scientists in some sort of way. And again, that is meant to be a feature of the view. That's a good thing. It means that we're not just sort of off doing whatever the hell that we do. In fact, we are part of the grand scientific enterprise. And there's some comfort in that. It's a very nice thing if you're worried about, say, the government taking away your money. Nobody wants to take the money away from the scientists. Hey, we're scientists too, baby. But before we go into the objections or anything, can pause. Ask, what questions do you have for me on the view? We have the kind of core of the concept. Again, the big thought here is, right, much of philosophical discourse is going to turn out to be nonsense because it makes claims that aren't verifiable, not even verifiable in principle. That's why metaphysical debates are defective. There is no way to settle these, and the reason there's no way to settle these is there's not even a debate in the first place. Nobody was ever saying anything. Says the view. Okay. So we're at 35. Can we do the two objections, then we'll take a little break? Objections will take us maybe 5 to 10. What's a problem for this? It's worth noting that as it happens, there's not that many logical positivists anymore. There's still a bunch of people who have a positivist hangover, but there aren't many of these LPists full-blown. Here's the biggest reason why. The biggest reason why, and it's kind of close, we talked about this already, or gestured at something like it. It's often called the self-refuting objection. And the core of it is that the verification principle itself is nonsense. By the lights, the verification principle. So take the verification principle, right, which tells us, we'll take the one that we read a second ago, right? Hey, in order to be sensible, you're either analytic or verifiable in principle. Is the verification principle analytic? Doesn't seem like it. Doesn't seem like there's meaning, or that the meaning of the word meaning tells us something about verification. That's something we've learned. Right? In fact, I've been trying to argue it to you for the last 45 minutes. So it's not analytic. Is it verifiable? Doesn't really seem like it. There doesn't seem to be any in-principle verification activity that you could do that would verify the VP. Cool. So that means the verification principle is nonsense. It doesn't say anything. And if it doesn't say anything, then there's no way to even articulate the view. Remember when I said, oh, here's how we differentiate the sensible ones from the nonsensible ones? I didn't actually tell you anything there. So goes the objection. Again, the core problem here is that if the principle itself is meant to be meaningful, it needs to be analytic or verifiable. It's not analytic, and it doesn't seem to be verifiable. The principle itself looks meaningless. That's bad. Yeah.
But if it would seem like playing a game, if it would be like a rule, you don't have to apply the rules on itself, right?
Good. So that's one of the first moves back. Okay, good. So let's think about it. But again, before we move to the kind of replies, do we get a feel for the objection? Do we see it? Okay. Now, so here's Carnap's, a sort of Carnap's reply, and it's very similar to what you just suggested. It's the verification principle isn't an assertion in the object language. It's a rule about how the object language behaves. Right? If you guys remember, the object language is a language we talk about, and the meta-language is the language we use to talk about that language. So last year I taught you first-order logic, and I taught it to you using English. FOL is the object language, English is the meta-language. So one thing we could say, the verification principle is not a claim in English, it's a claim in the meta-language, which is English. Cool. Either we have to then say there's English 1 and English 2, or it's the same and then the move hasn't helped. But let's go with the first one. There's English 1 and there's English 2. English 2 is the meta-language, and the verification principle was something expressed in that. Well, okay. We're still going to have a principle that tells us what are the meaningful versus non-meaningful expressions in the meta-language. And if that's not the verification principle, we've got a problem. Because then we can say, why is something other than the verification principle good enough for meaningfulness or non-meaningfulness in the meta-language, but not in the object language? Why couldn't I use it there too? Or if it is, then it's not the verification principle that does it at the meta-language, it's the meta-verification principle, which is in the meta-meta language. But then, of course, we'd have to ask about the meta-meta language, and we'd need to have something like the verification principle in the meta-meta-meta language, and you can see where this is going.
Achilles and turtle thing.
Either we're going to have an infinite hierarchy of meta-languages, or it's just going to collapse at some point, and we've lost the whole VP to begin with. Somebody else is doing the meaningfulness, non-meaningfulness distinction. So I like the suggestion. It's a rule, but it still has to be meaningfully expressed. And if it's ever meaningfully expressed, then it's fucking wrong. That's the trick. That's the trick. Now, there's ways to try and get around it. But what I want you to see is just at least the initial difficulty. There's something really attractive, I think, about this idea of maybe we can tie meaningfulness to something like an empirical accessibility. But as soon as we do that with any kind of teeth, we'll run into this. So there's our first objection. The verification principle itself is meaningless according to the rule it lays down. Now here's the second objection. And the second objection is in some sense even more wicked, but it's beautiful. This is Hempel's objection. Hempel's objection first starts with two assumptions, and they're very plausible. Assumption one is that a sentence is meaningful if and only if it's true or false. So we'll just say an assertoric sentence is meaningful if and only if it takes some truth value, being true or being false. Second assumption is that for any sentence S, any assertoric sentence S, S is true if and only if its negation is false. Just basically saying something about how negation works. Okay? With these two, we're able to show that given the verification principle, every sentence is meaningful. Doesn't matter. Pick any sentence you like. The usual example is that the absolute is lazy. Or the nothings. Or green triangles, or green colorless triangles sleep furiously. Whatever you want. We're going to make it turn out meaningful. Here's how we do it. Take any true meaningful sentence. For example, that this little bit bar here is blue, right? Call that P. And take any grammatically correct sentence Q. Doesn't matter what it is. Okay? And take the conjunction P and Q. This conjunction has to be meaningful. And it has to be meaningful because it entails a sentence that's meaningful. And if you remember, to go back a few, that was one of the ways we can tell a sentence was meaningful. So the conjunction is meaningful. Now we ask, is it true? Well, if it's true, then if you guys remember, right, conjunctions are only true if both conjuncts are true, so Q is true. Whatever the hell Q is. Okay, cool. Well, if it's true, then it's got to be meaningful, given 1. So cool, Q turns out meaningful. Okay, what happens if the conjunction's false? Well, then Q has to be false. But if Q's false, then given assumption 1, it's meaningful. Yeah.
So why must the conjunction be meaningful if just P is meaningful? If I say it's raining and green triangles sleep furiously, then that would just be a bullshit sentence, wouldn't it?
Good. So the important thing here is this last little bit. So this is something that the logical positivists allow for. Sometimes we'll determine that a sentence is meaningful because it is entailed by some other sentences. So the meaning here goes both ways. Effectively, the entailment means that the sentence entailed and the entailing sentence both have to be meaningful. Another way to get it, you guys remember we talked about how easy it is to make disjunctions true. Effectively, this objection plays off of that. Take any meaningful sentence you like, P, and then just add as a disjunct any sentence you want, Q. Grass is green, or colorless green triangles sleep furiously. Is that disjunction true? If it's true, it has to be meaningful. That's all this is doing, in slightly fancier terms. The entailment relation suffices to guarantee meaning. Now here's the reason why. I'm looking skeptical, and that's sensible. Remember how we defined entailment. To ask you another way, who remembers the definition of validity? Impossible. Fuck.
Sentence is valid if not both.
Argument.
I would say a sentence, that doesn't work. Argument is valid if only if it's impossible for a premise to be true and the conclusion is false.
Nice. So note, that already tells us something. The sentences and things that we're considering have to be truth apt. Entailment already means that we've got meaningfulness on both sides. That's the trick. That's really what this is. If we can even construct the entailment and understand, or construct the conjunction and understand the entailment relation from P and Q to Q, which is easy, P and Q already has to be meaningful, which is all we really need. Doesn't need to be true or false or nothing. Just needs to be meaningful.
Seems circular. Seems circular reasoning, because you presuppose meaningful and then you get meaningful.
But remember, what we're trying to do here is we use the tools that the logical positivists give us. And one of the tools is this idea about entailment. We're asking about this idea of the meaningful sentences are going to be ones that either we verify in principle or are going to follow from ones that we already can verify in principle.
So analytic then.
Could be analytic, could be ones that we can verify in principle, or they could be associated with them in various entailment relations. That's the bit we're playing with, that last part. Hempel's objection is genius, and it's brutal. Because what it basically does is it puts the positivist in a bind. Either they can say, certain entailments don't guarantee meaning. Now they've got to tell us what's the difference between good entailments and bad entailments. And note, the things that they're going to articulate here will not be ones done in terms of analyticity or in terms of verification. They're already losing because they have to start saying more about what counts as meaningful or not in terms of their verification principle. This, combined with Hempel's objection, is a terrible trap. They have to have more, but they can't have more because they've told us the only way to be meaningful is to get verification in principle or be analytic. Bad. No, again, there's ways to go. We can fight this. But these are the big reasons, these are some of the big reasons why this view hasn't really lasted. There are other objections we might raise. Probably the most famous one I haven't even mentioned, which is Quine's objection to the analytic-synthetic distinction. If there's no analytic-synthetic distinction, then one of the core parts of the verification principle turns out to be nonsense, which is delightful. We're not going to talk about this because that's something you'll definitely talk about in the history of analytic class. But the thing to note is there are relatively few positivists remaining. But a lot of analytic philosophy still operates within something like this positivist hangover. Specifically, what they've taken to mind is that some philosophical claims might just be nonsense. Look like genuine, meaningful claims, but are actually just nothing burgers in disguise. And it is worth noting that positivism is, in some ways, tantalizingly attractive because it gives you a way to make philosophical progress possible. It makes it epistemically feasible in a way that so many other views just simply don't. It tells us a way that we could do philosophy meaningfully and have clear progress. Or at least it seems like it does. But of course, that's the whole point. Right? There's a bunch of stuff that seems like it's making progress, but it's not. The delightful irony, the positivist view itself looks like it falls to that trap. So that's positivism. It was this beautiful option that, once we actually poke it a little bit, just collapses in upon itself. The next view I want to talk about, this ordinary language philosophy view, stems almost immediately out of the collapse of positivism. And it runs with many of the same ideas, but in very different directions. But before we do that, let's take a break. So it's at 52 right now. We take 8 minutes to go to 11. We'll take a break till 11. Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, noon. Let's take a break to an hour ago.